I'm Jason Cherry. Yeah, this is since almost 2014, so about a decade. I worked on uh, the stuff that I sort of researched of the life of this major William Trent, who I'll refer to. I always refer to his father and of course, the owner of the house he's outside here as sort of Judge Trent. Sort of gets because being with William and William, it gets confusing. Um, so Major Trent would be the highest ranking he would think. So I usually refer to him as Major Trent. And that's what the biography that I worked on, like I said, for almost 10 years. Accumulated close to 3,000 documents, receipts, and journals and things in Trent's hand to put together and let him sort of tell the story of what remotely became a fascinating figure in the 18th century. And I think it was put best of a lot of the people that have done reviews already said that you virtually brought forth somebody that was an important figure in the 18th century and made who was seemingly unknown being known again and relevant to, especially with America's birth coming up here, 250 years here, starting next year on. So, yeah, so let's start where the early life of this Major William Trent, or William Trent Jr., as we refer to him. He was the son of, and I say Judge Trent, and as you can see, that's his signature there, above me there, of Judge Trent. As he would sign his documents, numerous things. That was his father, like I said, Judge William Trent. And he was, believe it or not, was a third generation merchant. His grandfather was also a merchant there in Scotland. And this is his mother, Mary Coddington, from the Coddington family based in, she was born in Newport, Rhode Island. If you visit Newport, there's actually a Coddington family cemetery. A lot of her uncles and I believe her grandfather, who was once the governor of the Rhode Island colony, is also buried there. And this signature you see here, believe it or not, is the signature of a teenage Mary Coddington. Believe it or not, a Quaker wedding between Thomas Story and Anne Shippen in 1706 there in Philadelphia. And every great thing about a Quaker wedding is everybody that attends the wedding have to give their signatures if they're able to write. If you're ever researching or trying to find somebody and a family member, you can look at that because at their wedding certificate, they're all witnesses according to the Quakers. So everybody would sign, and she's just one of many, probably about 30 names that were on that attended this wedding. Some of the weddings that were more extravagant would have 130 signatures as weddings. With this one, Mary Coddington, about 13 years old at the time, would sign. And so, yes, so this William Trent was born right here, based on the evidence, born in Trenton, New Jersey here. What's believed to be March or April of 1722. And we based this on my research when he started his apprenticeship in Pennsylvania. He would eventually have to complete his apprenticeship, and this one being a mercantile, learning under a merchant, Edward Shippen III. And he would start this and eventually have to complete it by the age of 21. That was the law. So at this point, going back to, he completed his, what it's based on, late 1743, 1744. And going back in time, there being the 21 years of age, it's based on with the change of the original Julian calendar that the end of March was basically the new year at that time, at least till 1752, 51 to 1752. And basically it would believed on that Trent was probably born here at the 1719 William Trent House here in March or April. If anything, it was the beginning of April, 1722. And then eventually, growing up, it's believed that's based on the evidence that he would probably receive numerous tutors. I mean, we see the signature of his mother at 13 years of age, who would have a Quaker education background. But after she married his father, eventually would be written out of the Quaker meeting. But being so, her educational background, her brother eventually that would move in, William Morris, half brother, being that her stepfather was Anthony Morris, a Quaker brewer and merchant there in Philadelphia. She would eventually bring in probably tutors and teachers from the Quaker school. The William Penn Charter School, eventually, by the time Trent was born, was open to not just Quakers, but also anybody that could afford to be there. The William Penn Charter School is still open today and still still active today. But based on that evidence, they probably hired up tutors and different things to come to the house to teach his education. But when he was of age and going on, he would eventually be apprenticed with what would be Mary Coddington, Trent, her first cousin, Edward Shippen III. Edward Shippen III, a wealthy merchant of the Shippen family, would eventually also be, if you recognize that last name, he was also not only the founder of the Shippensburg, Pennsylvania in 1730, the settlement, but also the grandfather of Margaret Shippen, or what we know as Peggy Shippen, during the Revolution. The basically the wife of Benedict Arnold, the traitorous general, according to history. But at this time, yes, he would apprentice with Edward Shippen III. Like I said, I show that. Let's see if we see this here. And this would be Edward Shippen III's signature and his wax seal behind me, showing the showcase. The Shippens were from basically the area of Coventry, England, and they would showcase it by having sort of the crest there on the seal. And then this right here, although no paintings are actually known of Edward Shippen III, this is the only known. It's a silhouette at Winterthur that was of Edward Shippen III. And as you can see, it sort of almost reminds you of Benjamin Franklin when you look at the silhouette, but that was the only known, at least picture / silhouette of Edward Shippen III, who Trent would study under. And then eventually, this is a receipt that was found in the Library of Congress that I was finding. In the Edward Shippen papers, there were a lot of vital information, especially you'd see earlier deeds and different things that Edward Shippen would sign and Trent would sign underneath it. But this one still proved that he was still taking his apprenticeship then. This was in 1742, and he writes here that the hands, he says, pounds on the account of my master, Edward Shippen, meaning that he's still working at that time as an apprentice for Edward Shippen III in Philadelphia as late as 1742. It's believed possibly by 1743 or late spring of 1743, he completed this, began working as a clerk for Edward Shippen. And then it would be then that by the following year, he would have a deed that he would sign along with Edward Shippen at the Treaty of Lancaster, one of the most important, at least groundbreaking of the time, in 1744. So in the 1740s, as Trent was sort of making a name for himself as basically a merchant there in the height of what began as the fur trade, another opportunity arose. King George's War broke out. It was from the 1740, 1744 to about 1748. It was basically a sort of lost known war. It was part of the War of Austrian Succession, and it sort of poured in from Canada into the New England states. And at this time, it was then Pennsylvania was commissioned to have 4 companies. Trent would be one of these such captains. And he began recruiting. This is a picture of the modern day of the 2nd Street and Arch Street, home of the Sign of the George. It was called the Sign of the George, or it was also known in the paper as the St. George and the Dragon Inn in Philadelphia. This is the present day site of what it is today. This is where he would recruit his 106 men that he would have in his colony. And in this one here, for the Pennsylvania men that he recruited, you have to understand too, he was commissioned a captain, but he was paid directly from the king. These were independent companies that were paid from His Majesty's service in 1746. Though they didn't see action as they headed into New York, it would be Trent, though, and his unit would be attacked by French and Indians and survive an ambush in the spring of 1747. And this would be the present-day site of where he was ambushed. It was believed to be that the battle was so severe, an account of a captive of that day, they said there were 6 men scalped during this ambush, and in which Trent lost a lot of supplies, but were able to hold off the men enough until the Fort Clinton force could come in and support them there, just north of Saratoga. But it would be there that one of the captives that was taken to the French fort actually believed Captain Trent was killed at this battle. Writing in the account that Captain Trent was one of these 6 that were killed. As of show, that wasn't rightfully so, but they believe in how severe that ambush was. But eventually he would return with his service there, military service as a veteran captain, and return back and go up the fur trade again. He would rejoin his on and off again partner, George Crowan, and they would find a merchant named Richard Hockley who had a good store in Philadelphia. And then Hockley had connections with the Penn family. Thomas Penn, who he served under, was considered sort of a protege. They formed a mercantile firm in 1748, and this was their logo. It would be Hockley, Trent, and Crowan, and that would be a logo sort of like we would see today, and they would stamp this on all the barrels. And it was one of these such letters and receipts that they would show this on all their receipts, which I thought was interesting. And it would be in 1748 into 49 that Trent would see Thomas Penn in London and would see for the first time a bustling city like that. Nothing what he probably saw in Philadelphia and different things, being that was such a big city as well. But not only did they get goods and possible some loan of some merchants, he also contracted, unfortunately, intermittent fever. being back the barrels, there was an outbreak as they were leaving Gravesend, England, and eventually would contract this, him and George Croghan himself, and it was believed to be from the barrels and supplies that they received from London. The mosquitoes were there, and that by doing so and loading it where they were being in what would be present-day Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, where Croghan had not only a warehouse, but also a barn, where Trent had a cabin. On this property is when they contracted this here. And unfortunately, it would be a disease, and if you know what intermittent fever is, it's known today as malaria. So at that time, he would be on and off again with this disease pretty much for the rest of his life. But as the end of the 1740s happened, Cumberland County, Pennsylvania was formed, one of the big, large counties there, west there of the nome of Philadelphia and Bucks County and Chester County. One of the first district justices was not only George Croghan, because they lived in that area. Originally, their cabin or so was what was believed to be Lancaster County, and then when Cumberland County was formed in 1749, it became Cumberland County. So Trent was elected then as a district justice. You can see in this picture, and this is one of the original deaths that was shown there. By 1750, it's dated and would have been used by all the district justices of Cumberland County in Cumberland County's first courthouse. Today, it's Widows Piper's Tavern in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, which was first county seat before it was moved to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And this would be the original room where the district justices would handle the marriage licenses and any kind of disputes and different things that we could see. Let me get out of the way here for a second. They had that. The desk and the ladder-back chair that you see beside it was also original from 1750. So as we move into 1750, this was what Trent did in this decade. He would aid in what was known as the Burke Cabins Expedition. It was an expedition, believe it or not. They had a treaty struck in 1749, and it was in this area here, as you see in this picture. This is known as the Path Valley, or basically in what today is Franklin and Fulton County, Pennsylvania, sort of south central Pennsylvania. In this area here, it was at the Burke Cabins Expedition that they lined up cabins to give the Indians things and on their land. And it would be at this point, as they were doing so, it was contracted that no settlers, or at least white settlers, were allowed to be over the west of what was known as the Blue Mountains. And it would be by 1750, that summer there, that they realized that all the cabins they laid out for the Indians to have on this land and to settle were occupied by white settlers. It would be at this point in May and into June of 1750 that William Trent would eventually help and aid almost it was 15 to 20 district justices of Cumberland County, and they would go in and basically arrest these trespassers and burn all the cabins that were there. The 11 cabins that Trent was involved with that was burned there west of what was known then as, or was known today as Phoenixburg, would still be known today as early as 1758 and known today as Burnt Cabins, Pennsylvania. And that is still a remark from that. It was an interesting expedition because at this point, it was the first of its such of trying to support the Indians and set an example of settlers coming into the Western country. But as they soon found out, this only delayed it further as far as doing so. But it was also a busy year because Trent would be elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly. He would vote on a new State House bell. It's a part of this. That State House bell became the Liberty Bell. It would be part of not only Benjamin Franklin, but it would be every county, at least existing at the time, in the fall of 1751. And vote on what was then, like I said, the new State House bell for what we know as today as Independence Hall. And it would be, they would vote on this. It wouldn't be loaned to the Liberty Bell until after basically into the 19th century. But it would also be at this time, as they voted on the thing, that Trent would purchase a tall pace clock from John Wood Sr. Basically, it was on what was known then as the alley that was a bunch of clockmakers in Philadelphia. They were known as, it was called, at least known in the paper in the Pennsylvania Gazette, Sign of the Dial. Because there were all these clock makers and clock fixers basically in that. And so at that, he purchased a clock, and he was living at that time in property at Plantation in 1751 in Middleton Township, which would be closer to the town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But then in November of 1752, there we go. He would become the factor or the account keeper for basically, let's go ahead of myself. Factor of the Ohio Company, which was at that time the largest land speculating agency in the world. It was run by wealthy landowners from the northern neck of Virginia. Basically, it was founded by Thomas Lee of the Lee families. Basically, would be the descendant would be General Robert E. Lee, would also be a descendant of this Thomas Lee that founded this company in 1748. Would also be I think, with George Washington's older half brothers, Augustine and Lawrence Washington. but eventually expanded from not only the Northern Neck, wealthy landowners of Virginia, but into Maryland and other people. And Trent would be basically handling all the account books and their main warehouse, which by the fall of 1752 would be there at what would be known today, right outside of, right across from present-day town of Cumberland, Maryland. Back then, it was Frederick County, Virginia. Today, it's Ridgely, West Virginia, where this main warehouse was. It would be their main base of operations when the expeditions came. And one such expedition was while working with the Indians, and especially a voice of the Six Nations, the Half King. Trent would build a fort at the Forks of the Ohio. And if you don't know what the Forks of the Ohio was, here, the modern day city of Pittsburgh, at the point there where the Monongahela and the Allegheny River formed the Ohio River. It would be there that they attempted to build the first English outpost there in the spring of 1754. Eventually, that would fail, mainly because Trent would be waiting on George Washington, who was trying to highly recruit some men in Virginia. By the time Washington was able to finally get recruits there, the French would come down from Lake Erie, push what was left of Trent's men out, eventually build their own fort called Fort Duquesne. And that would stand for the thing of the French-Indian War. It would basically be what would lead to the first shots of the French-Indian War and eventually spread globally, called the 7 Years' War at this thing. But eventually then, as the French-Indian War would break out, Trent and George Crone, with his trading expeditions and exploits there into the Western country, would have been to lose some money. So they would draft an act of relief. It was the first of its kind. Trent would draft it and send it to the Privy Council and to the King George II there in 1755, of getting a release for almost 10 years of having to be out of debt. And by doing so, he had the people that he owed money to sign this act of relief. He had it published in the colonies and he had it sent to Europe. At the time, the Privy Council would actually approve of it and actually give him proof that he would not have to pay any creditors for at least 10 years, at least to a point that until the king realized what he was actually signing. So as the French had control of the Ohio Valley, I said, taking over and building Fort Duquesne, another expedition after 3 years later in 1758 would come. It would be led by General John Forbes. A lot of things in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Forbes Field, Forbes Avenue, are named after the guy you see right here in the picture. This is a young picture of General John Forbes. But beyond this expedition, Trent would be assigned to speak to the natives. And at Fort Loudon in Pennsylvania, he would basically come between a tryst between the Indians who wanted their supplies and the Virginian and Pennsylvanians. And it would be at this time that Trent would basically de-escalate the situation. And by doing so and doing it such a good job, General Forbes would appoint him as the assistant superintendent of the whole Western expedition, in charge of the natives there from Fort Loudon on. And it would be eventually that the British would retake, after the French abandoned Fort Duquesne, and retake what we know today as Pittsburgh, and then became Pittsburgh there by the modern day thing here. So in the 1760s, as they would be building in Pittsburgh in 1758, and eventually into 59 and 1760, Trent would join basically a Lancaster firm of merchants. And 3 other merchants that he would join, they would want to construct, as they were in Pittsburgh there, they were going to construct a large fortification. By 1761, it was one of the largest British fortifications, basically in North America. And at this city of Pittsburgh here, where they would have Fort Pitt, William Trent would have the largest store that wasn't one that was part of the fort. They had one called the King's Commissary. It was a very large storehouse that they would sell items from. But Trent would have the rival store basically outside of Fort Pitt, called in the lower town. He appointed, when they did the census in 1761, Trent had 3 different locations that he would basically have his houses and things for. And this would be sort of a map here of what Fort Pitt sort of looked like as late of 1758 or 1759 on, showing the lower town would eventually be closer to where the water was. The upper town would be almost into downtown Pittsburgh, past the walls here. And eventually, as this happened, and then the sort of outbreak of what Trent would realize the late Indian War in the 1760s, today we know as as Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's Uprising. That would be giving his military experience, previously King George's War, previously in the French and Indian, being a 2-time veteran captain. he was a sort of a shoe-in to be in charge of the militia garrison when the Indians laid siege to Fort Pitt. And at this time, it would be part of this sort of controversial decision. Trent would keep a journal. It would be in this journal that we would realize that there were the natives that were there laying siege to Fort Pitt would eventually be given gifted blankets that were from the British smallpox hospital that was at Fort Pitt. And it would be there at Trent, as he's writing in his journal, would write in there saying that they would gift these blankets. It was 2 blankets and a handkerchief to this, basically to the Indians that came that wanted gifts to take home to their Indian towns. And it was known at this time, too, that Trent's second in command, Josiah Davenport, who was also working as the King's commissary, would probably, based on the evidence, be the one that personally gave the blankets to the Indians. Because at that time, at least what they believed or what was going on, you weren't allowed to be in the smallpox hospital unless you either were immune from it, you had a vaccine, or, like I said, you were working as a doctor. And seeing that Trent was neither and was not immune or have a vaccine from it, Josiah Davenport was. And in Philadelphia, his family, there was an outbreak in the 1750s, would actually get the vaccine because his youngest child would have contracted. It would be him that would probably, based on the evidence, take it, the blankets and the handkerchief from the store and give it to him, which Trent did not record that. And it was funny, even in the actual journal that wasn't Trent's, it made no mention of giving anything, sort of omitted from the journal. And it was Trent the one that basically wrote the firsthand out saying that they were giving the blankets and that. And also Josiah Davenport, the nephew of Benjamin Franklin, was a former baker in Philadelphia, and his mother, Sarah Davenport, was also formerly Sarah Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's sister. And some recruits, just to mention here about Fort Pitt, Simon Girty, a well-known basically loyalist during the Revolution, and also his brothers, I believe James and Thomas, were also there at Fort Pitt, listed on the roster. And in addition was James Smith, the leader of the Black Boys Rebellion in 1765. All of proof that Trent had a notorious reputation for hiring shady characters in his units. Between the Trent's company there, of former employees of the Ohio Company in 1754, to his recruits in 1746. I mentioned the 106 men he recruited at the St. George and the Dragon Inn. There would be numerous advertisements at that time in the Pennsylvania Gazette run by Benjamin Franklin, and they all would say there'd be criminals or runaways, and we're not sure where they are, but if we do, it's suspected that they are in Captain Trent's unit. So you can only imagine that, in fact, but Trent may have been smart and sort of a pioneer in his thinking, because he figured these criminals and runaways and thieves weren't going to desert because they were just happy to be away from the law at this time. So he never usually, based on evidence, probably had anybody that actually deserted from his unit, maybe 1 or 2, but not very many. And as you see today, that's a modern day, that's the flag bastion that still exists in downtown Pittsburgh. It's one of the last few original bastions that's still in the city of Pittsburgh today. Still sort of exists right in the middle of downtown. And as Fort Pitt and the late Indian War, as it was called, broke out, and then more and more of these traders went into debt, Trent being one of them. And so by 1763 into 1764, oh, and another point here about the controversial gifting, Josiah Davenport, who we said based on the evidence, probably personally is the one that gave the blankets. He's the only one promoted as an officer at the end when Colonel Henry Bouquet, the overall commander, would come to Fort Pitt and give congratulations to the men of holding off the Indians there, laid siege there by July of 1763 into August 1763. Josiah Davenport's promoted from a lieutenant to a captain. He's the only officer that's promoted. So it's possible, based on that, Henry Bouquet, who had sent the orders about gifting the blankets, was basically commending Josiah Davenport for personally doing that. But by 1764 and 1765, these traders, just like Trent and backcountry merchants, were all into debt. And at this point, he made a list and affidavits of everything that was owed. Trent went around recording all these. So eventually, their goal was to hopefully set up an Indian treaty that they could hopefully get back these debts. And by doing so, one of these such suggestions was the largest Indian treaty at that time in 1768. Sir William Johnson, the superintendent of Indian Affairs, would eventually arrange it. And for this treaty, which was held basically up towards near Rome, New York, basically eventually called the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, in 1768, he wanted basically William Trent as the secretary, take down the minutes. He was always notorious for his penmanship, writing numerous deeds for not only George Crowan, but for anybody, at least up till 1769 and beyond. Any Indian treaty or native council that was gone, when they needed somebody to be the secretary or write down the minutes, William Trent was the one they hired. He was the one, he was notorious for his penmanship. As you can see right here, this picture here, the Treaty of Indians, that is the original book. It's in Philadelphia that Trent took of the Treaty of Stanwix in 1768. Like I said, it was the largest basically native council or Indian treaty assembled at the time. There were over 2,200 Indians that were at this thing here, and it would receive basically a condition of land. They would receive the debts that they were owed in money were promoted then in wealth. It was almost 86,000 pounds worth of money promoted into land. And Trent would keep this journal, the Treaty of Stanwix, would be over 110 pages of minutes. He would write in detail of everything there. So at this time, as Trent writes down the minutes, he receives this condition of land. They need one more thing to get this final approval and hopefully get this land in a charter, basically a whole land for these traders and anybody that Trent jotted down that lost during not only the French and Indian War, but also during what he called the late Indian War of Pontiacs. They needed the Crown's approval. They needed to go to Parliament, get His Majesty's signature, King George III. So at that time, by late 1769, Trent, being the acting attorney, along with Samuel Wharton, another friend of his, a Quaker merchant in Philadelphia, would head to London. And this would be the advertisement of the boat that Trent would take. It lists, it's great about the Pennsylvania Gazette. It always lists the stuff that's living there. And you can see he wrote on the ship, the Betsy. He even lists the captain, Seymour Hood. It lists as a master, and even says it sails when it's set. And it said also on here, you can see for freight or passage, you would apply to Thomas Clifford, who actually was in charge of the dock there, one of the wharfs, and it would be him that you would see or visit what was known then as the London Coffee House. That was sort of a place that they would hand these advertisements as well as publish them in Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette. So by the 1770s here, Trent would arrive in London. His first stop, Benjamin Franklin's house in London. And it would be Franklin that would be very interested. He wrote numerous letters before the Treaty of Fort Stanwix there. So by 1769, he would arrive in London and he would head up the Strand. That's the main drag today. If you're familiar with London, it still is. And he would meet Franklin on Craven Street. And this right here is, I visited here, believe it or not, back in summer of 2022. This is the guest parlor, original to the date in Benjamin Franklin's house. It's the last standing or only standing right now of Benjamin Franklin's full house. It's still original. And it would be in this house there on Craven Street and in this parlor that William Trent and Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Wharton would have dinner and would also discuss this proposal of land that they got from the Indians there from the Treaty of Stanwix. And Trent, believe it or not, didn't stay there with Franklin. Franklin would be renting this off of a woman named Margaret Stevenson, who owned the house there on Craven Street. But he would reside close. This is the modern day. Once it comes up here, you can see the modern day site of what was then a Villiers Street. And this would be where Trent would stay on this. And this was I walked this here a couple of years ago. And Villiers Street was only an alley or two over from where Craven Street thing was. And there was a short alley that connected and came right out at the house. So at this point, Trent said he lived with a couple of coal merchants, the Cranage brothers, who would actually patent pig iron in London. It would be Trent that would sit there and they would discuss basically, like I said, the daily or at least every other day. And Trent would take down basically the notes and everything for this company they were trying to form. Basically at that time, being that he was a member of the Ohio Company, meaning that he was meeting with not only Franklin and other people, he was meeting with the London Postmaster, Anthony Todd, also members of Parliament. He decided to call this the Grand Ohio Company while he was in London. And they would also meet not only there, but Franklin deemed it not safe to maybe meet at that house. They decided to meet at another place, sort of meet in secret and not announce it, called the Crown and Anchor. And unfortunately today that tavern doesn't exist. The site of it does. Up here. Okay, there we go. Well, actually, this is the second place he would live. Trent would live here from Villiers Street. He would live on New Suffolk Street. That's the modern day. It's now called Nassau Street. And believe it or not, all these locations, Villiers Street, New Suffolk Street, were all places that William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's son, the royal governor, eventually the royal governor of New Jersey, would recommend, as Trent was also not only fought with him in 1746 when William Franklin was a young ensign, but would also be friends through numerous land dealings with the Burlington Company, based on merchants out of Burlington, New Jersey. Would recommend these places to stay and rent when he was over in London. So at this time, that was Villiers. And then eventually, they would meet at the Crown and Anchor Tavern. They would list at Franklin. They would almost, according to the results at the time, this is an old sketch. As you can see, sort of at the bottom here, this is St. Clement Danes Church, but right here is the Crown and Anchor. There's sort of a wooden sign there at the bottom, right hand of the screen. And today, like I said, once again, it was great to walk these sort of in London and see what Trent was seeing when he was talking about it. Now, ironically, it's not a tavern anymore. It's sort of our version of the London's version of Panera Bread, but it's still at this point would have been sitting something that would have, given food and everything. And St. Clement's Church, as you can see in the background above the trees, is still there. So as this is sort of shows the modern day site as they met the Crown and Anchor there in 1769. But it would be there as they would present to the Board of Trade, Lord Hillsborough, who would suggest that they should charter a larger company. If you wanted more Londoners to come in on this, maybe, $1 million, $2 million is too short of a thing. How about a larger colony, like 20 million acres, and which they would decide as early as 1770, they wanted to name it Pittsylvania was going to be the name of the colony, and name it for, at the time, or at least the former prime minister, William Pitt, the elder at the time, because there were eventually William Pitt the younger would be. And William Pitt, of course, was where they named Pittsburgh. So it would be, that's what they were naming, at least up till 1773. But at this time in the early 1770s, and this is what brings up an interesting thing, they would visit the court of St. James, or what was known then as the Cockpit along Whitehall. Today, Whitehall Road is still basically privy to that. But before they could go to the court of St. James, Trent would eventually have a coat made. The coat you see right over there, said at least part of it made. Would be a court suit that they would make. He would describe one that Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Wharton would actually have when they arrived over there. In fact, Trent would actually remark that basically, musingly would say he saw Samuel Wharton. He says there's no more Quaker in him anymore. He's wearing a nice silk suit, carrying a sword, heading to courts. And at that time, Trent was just handling the books. He didn't actually go to court till him in 1772. So at least the first 3 years, he didn't have this court suit made. At least not till then, because it was about June and July of 1772 when it was arranged that they were all going to go down to Whitehall and visit the Cockpit. Trent would have it made here. I was able to actually talk with the curator of the Victorian Albert Museum in London. And it was then I had the close-up pictures of the exact waistcoat there. And it was when they realized that it could only been two places it was made at that time. It would be made in London, or it could be made in France. And she said, if you don't see a custom mark on the bottom of the coat, which Sam and I here both looked here a couple years back to see if there wasn't a custom mark. It was made right in London. He said, and she said there's only one place they would have made it, at least at that time, in London. It's called the East End of London, called Spitalfields. It was home of all the French silk weavers. And this is Fournier Street. This was one of the weaver houses you can even visit. There's a few now. They even have a museum now that shows that they were basically French Huguenot weavers that came over from France and settled there as early as the late 1760s and began basically this sort of revolution of these new type of styles. One being, Anna Garthwaite, who handled basically the flower brocades. Some you can even see on the thing. Those were all inspired by this, and eventually the style basically from 1750s almost to the 1790s at that time. And not only would Trent have it made, like I said, he would have it made. He would go with Samuel Wharton, Reverend William Hanna. Reverend William Hanna would actually be a friend of Sir William Johnson. And it would be there that Reverend William Hanna would actually write, I would make the paper actually, them presenting this charter of colony and supposedly being, at least in the beginning stages, being approved. And this is the Cockpit Courts, which is the last sketch. It would be the last surviving building of Henry VIII's Whitehall Palace that was wiped out by a fire. And it would be still standing. It would be where they would held all the, basically the Privy Council meetings, and where Trent would go with this waistcoat and, of course, the full court suit along with Franklin and this. But Reverend William Hanna would write a letter right soon after this, after it made the paper. I think it was in July of 1772, and actually explained it. Not only was he there, he visited Westminster Abbey. It felt like And he remarked that he told William Johnson, I visited your uncle's memorial, Peter Warren, who was a naval commodore in the early 1740s. And it's ironic because today, when you visit the Westminster Abbey and you go in to get your headphones to go in, you can see the memorial of Peter Warren, still there on the left, same one that Reverend William Hanna wrote about in 1772, almost like a tourist. But so the colony was approved there at the cockpit, and they would get their next move would be, it would go not only from the private Privy Council and the Board of Trade, it would go to the Solicitor General Wedderburn. It would be him that would have to approve it next and be the final approval before they could finally charter it and begin it in the colonies here. And this would be in 1772. To pay attention to the date, because at this time there's some unrest in the colonies, of course, by this time. And Trent's hearing it from the other side. He's hearing what's going on in the colonies at different things. But as they sort of promoted, being that not only do they have American constituents in this company, they also have English. They have Thomas Walpole, well-known banker and parliament member. But they would also have Matthew Featherstone, one of the wealthiest men pretty much in England, let alone that. And he would be actually very acquaintances with Trent and Samuel Wharton. In fact, Trent would actually visit his house during his busy time of even promoting this colony as they were waiting, hopefully, to get the final approval, would visit there and visit. In fact, Matthew Featherstone would even invite him to Christmas at one point, of which Trent couldn't go because he had a relapse of malaria while he was in London. And he also, another member would be Edward Bancroft. And Edward Bancroft is notorious. For those who've seen the Franklin series on Apple TV, he has promoted, he was a friend of, acquaintance of Benjamin Franklin, also a scientist in France. But eventually, as they found out 100 years later after his death, he was a double agent for the British. And not till 1777 did he finally start this. So there were numerous letters that Trent's writing to him, not knowing that eventually he would defect to the British and basically inform them about everything. In fact, it's believed that the Treaty of Paris, when it was signed, was in the king's hand within a week, even though it hadn't been announced yet. So it proved that Edward Bancroft must have been pretty good at what he did, because nobody knew about it until after he died. But he would buy basically shares also in what was known then as, like I said, the Grand Ohio Company. But then they decide that to get even more appeal from London, maybe we should change it from Pennsylvania and do it for the Queen, Queen Charlotte. So they call it Vandalia. And they call it Vandalia because she is supposedly, according to the letters, descended from Vandalic tribesmen in basically Southern Europe and Northern Africa. And being so, they decided to do it in honor of her. And they call it Vandalia. So by the summer of 1773, this is known as Vandalia. And it's pretty, as far as everything, it's pretty influential, because Matthew Featherstone, who I mentioned, would build a tower on its property. And this is still there today. It's in ruins, calling it Vandalia Tower as a salute to this potential colony that was going to be formed. At one point, promoting it to be the 14th colony, 20 million acres. It was pretty large to do so there, about 1773. Eventually, Thomas Walpole would even call his house Vandalia House. But unfortunately, and then the debate would be, as they presented to the members, where would the capital be? Would it be Pittsburgh? Would it be Williamsburg? Would it be Philadelphia? Trent would argue first that, in his court suit, that Pittsburgh seemed to be the best, because Philadelphia is, if we're looking at Vandalia being from Pittsburgh on down to even Kentucky and present-day West Virginia, western and eastern Ohio, Philadelphia is pretty far, as is Williamsburg. So they would basically propose it and then agree on to be in Pittsburgh. But then it'll be, who would be the governor? Could it be Samuel Wharton? Could it be George Mercer? Samuel Wharton was so basically confident in this that eventually he would make plans to the governor's mansion, because at one point at Fort Pitt, there were two different houses that were there to house any of the commanding officers that were there. He already had a plan, confident enough in 1773 and 74, the dimensions and everything of his potential house in Pittsburgh, including to send seeds with Trent when he eventually returned to start building his garden for his supposed mansion. Now, one thing to be brought up here in Samuel Wharton at the time, if the king would have allowed this colony to take place, it would have been a royal colony, which means somebody like Samuel Wharton, being a Quaker, would have never been able to be the governor. They wanted somebody to be Anglican. So it would have probably been deferred to George Mercer, who at that time was part of he originally was a stamp master, but during the Stamp Act fled to London, was there, eventually bought shares into the Grand Ohio Company. So Trent then would return. They're realizing they had their colony, they were waiting on Wedderburn to get the thing. So at this time, he would eventually, not only when he left and would be the basically spring and late, almost early summer of 1775, that Trent would return back. And at this point, Trent was fearing to even write letters home. He would eventually write them with ship captains going to New York. So they would eventually go to George Crone and William Johnson there in the middle of basically the New York colony. Eventually would be taken to hopefully stop in Trenton to his wife, who at this time had found a plantation. This is a map and basically survey of this plantation here, which is only a couple miles, not even, about a mile and a half south of where we're sitting right now in South Trenton. The ferry, or at least that you show across, you see the big house here. This was still a Quaker house owned by Thomas Lambert, a Quaker merchant. Eventually, Trent would buy this and then also operate a ferry right there. And that ferry was where Marine Terminal Park is today, if you're familiar with this. But as they're sort of waiting and he decides to go back, he ends up finding out that they have restraining acts, the unrest in the colonies I mentioned. And the restraining acts of New York and New Jersey had been announced in London, but not in the colonies yet. It wouldn't go into effect till almost August. And it would be Trent that would actually smuggle papers out and present them when he arrived in Philadelphia to John Hancock, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, basically telling them what's to come already by doing so. And at this time, not everybody was in approval of this charter. George Morgan, who was a merchant and friend of Samuel Wharton, was so upset that he was not involved with this Grand Ohio Company in London, threatened to, as he put it, wring Trent's nose if he saw him on the street, according to the letter. As of which Trent's response was, pick a time and place, let me know, I'll be at the Indian Queen Tavern. The Indian Queen Tavern was at 4th and Market Street in Philadelphia. It was a well-known tavern. It was one of Trent's basically hangouts in 1763. And George Morgan's response to this of suggesting a duel, hopefully, was, oh, you took me serious at this. I was not trying to. And I think he realized a three-time veteran of 3 different conflicts probably isn't half bad at shots. At this point, it probably wouldn't be good as far as this time. So it settled and became friends. Eventually, George Morgan would also buy shares sort of into what he believed was going to be Vandalia. But at this property, too, as he arrives, like I said, in 1775, he comes to find out, at least arriving in Philadelphia, that shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord. And he knew something was up because when he stopped in Portsmouth, England, he witnesses a British ship named the Cerberus. And on the Cerberus, he sees 3 captains. It's written in a letter on April the 24th, 1775. He said this ship was waiting for a fair wind, and on it are Generals Burgoyne, Clinton, and Howe, heading to Boston, knowing not so ever what was going on at the time, because you figure this was 5 days after Lexington and Concord had broken the first shots, but the unrest had at least warranted enough that the king was sending troops already, not even knowing what was going on already in Massachusetts. So Trent at this time, being that he was sort of in the central, by the time 1776 breaks out and basically the wars are going on, the revolution is basically in full source here. The Hessians have taken over basically Trenton, not only controlling the town by St. Michael's Church and all throughout where people have houses, but also in Bordentown, which is just south. So at this point, where Trent's house is, you see in this picture, he's sandwiched in between Hessian forces. They're communicating by one road that goes across Trent's, called the Crosswicks Road. And it would be this time that they would cross at the Battle of Trenton. Those Hessians that are believed to have camped on the lawn just here by his former father's house and his birthplace. A lot of them would head, not only partaking in the battle, but a lot of them would head south, go on the Crosswicks Road, and head to Bordentown to learn support in case if any more American forces were coming to the south. It would be that Trent would probably hear then the artillery going off there not only across the water there from the cannons, but also what was going on in town, being that he was about a mile and a half away at the time. So as the Americans took over that town, Trent would eventually give supplies to at this time, and from his property. He would give cattle, he would give supplies, and he would also, believe it or not, give what was he known as, a spyglass, or what he called a pocket telescope, to the General Nathaniel Greene, lending him there as they were taking, either after the Battle of Trenton or the Second Battle of Trenton, being when they were commandeering the town. And this is part of today, showing that property on there. Part of William Trent's property, at least in South Trenton, He mentions a burial ground. And today, this is the section of the Thomas Lambert burial ground. It was a Quaker burying ground. It's now part of Riverview Cemetery. And that was all part of today where Trent's property would have lined and would have gone the whole way to the water there in the Delaware. Because then, as he would do from there, his ferry would operate, then called the New Ferry, and would operate what we know today as Marine Terminal Park. And he would ferry back and forth. It got so popular with the Continental soldiers, it was nicknamed the Continental Ferry. In fact, he was actually, and this is the view sort of looking from basically the Trenton side looking across the Delaware, that during the Continental Ferry, he offered a military discount for any active Continental soldier. So there were at least 7 or 8 ferries, along this stretch of the river, and he was getting a majority of the business because he was offering a discount for any active soldier. Nobody else could offer such thing. And he would not only just do soldiers, he offered General Daniel Morgan's rifles from the Battle of Saratoga. Horatio Gates' officers would stay in November of 1777, not only Trent's house, but they'll also eventually cross and join the rest of Washington's thing. And he would also, General John Nielsen of basically the New Jersey militia, he would ferry them from 1780 to 1781, almost 6 months across. Unfortunately, even as he's elected to the New Jersey Assembly there in 1780, he's accused basically of being a loyalist at this time. A lot of his former business partners are all gone to the British. So Trent in 1778 would give his oath of allegiance to the Patriot cause and to New Jersey. That would also get him elected then as the New Jersey Assembly. It would help even campaign for Governor William Livingston's re-election campaign. And in 1780, Livingston would win. And Trent would try to use that because as Vandalia got shelved, basically, because of the Revolution, he got it approved by Wedderburn, but the king said, we have bigger things to worry about now with the colonies and the outbreak of rebellion and war. So it got shelved. And at this point, Trent's still lobbying to try to get this charter back on the thing so he can start making money. By 1780, using that platform being on the New Jersey Assembly, he would use it to hopefully try to get this money back. He would sell numerous accounts to a Virginia delegate named John Grayson, John Paul Jones, a hero of the American Revolution. All these would buy shares in what then was not only Vandalia, but eventually he named Indiana because it was the land that he got from the Indians, and that's what they were naming at the time, really that Vandalia would probably not happen with the outbreak of the Revolution. But unfortunately, as he was sort of trying to get his feet going, more relapses of his illness in the 1780s. By 1782, Trent's in Philadelphia, meeting hopefully with his Indiana company, he calls it now, going over this land. And he ends up having a relapse of his fever. So he goes to see Dr. William Shippen. And this is the house today. Believe it or not, it was for sale up till about 2016. The house, they wanted $4.5 million for this 4-story house that rely on basically 4th Street and Chestnut Street. But it would be here that Trent would go there. Dr. William Shippen would keep a day book. She said Trent visited him 16 different times for medication, and it's believed based on that, it was probably recommended Portland powder. That was the new and sort of up-and-coming thing to deal with what was then what they believed was gout, not necessarily, but also would help with intermittent fever. Unfortunately, Portland powder would eventually be fatal, and I wouldn't know this until Dr. Benjamin Rush would write a paper on it in 1801, saying that you had a better chance of striking gold with silver than you would getting cure of gout, of which you would live within 2 years of Dr. Benjamin Rush would write by taking what we call Duke of Portland powder. And in March of 1782, it was pretty severe because at the same time he took this Portland powder, he also drafted a second will. He drafted a first one in 1775 on his return trip from London to Philadelphia. Eventually in 1782, he would write another one, as of which he would survive, but his health would worsen. And not only that, he would be able to fall basically behind on his payments. His ferry, although it was the Continental Ferry, got shifted. The Continental Ferry title got shifted up closer to this area here where Ferry Street was in modern day Trenton, New Jersey. And Trent would be behind on his mortgage, he would eventually have to foreclose. And by 1782, he went to court and lost, and eventually had to sell as is his house. And as Dr. Benjamin Rush would predict, it was within 2 years, Trent was basically on his deathbed. By July of 1784, he would write his final will, basically he would leave Trenton, sell his house as is, would come to Philadelphia, him and his wife. And basically what it's believed, according to his last account, we know about his will, but he didn't die till December the 1st, 1784. And it would be at this time, it's always believed, where's he buried? Some people claim it was Carlisle. Some people claim it was possibly even in Trenton, where it's believed his mother and father are buried there, up by where the former Hopewell Church and where the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital is today. But it's believed, at least in the papers, that when Trent died on December 1st, 1784, the river was so severe that nothing was going in and out across from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. So it's believed he was probably buried right in Philadelphia. And according to the last letter that's known about his death on December the 1st, 1784, it said he was either living with friends. At this time, his friends were the Todds, John Todd Sr., who was a Quaker teacher, basically on the corner of 4th and Chestnut, and also John Todd Jr., who was one of his lawyers that handled basically the will. John Todd Jr., believe it or not, who was not only a signature on Trent's will, his wife, being that he was at the time very young, was a young Quaker, basically heiress named Dolly Payne. John Todd Jr. and his father would both basically pass during the 1793 outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia. Dolly Payne would meet James Madison and become one of the future first lady, the fourth president of the United States. But at this time, yes, it was believed. Now, I have this picture of Willings Alley. It would be here that after the Portland powder didn't seem to work, he went to what was known as a healer or a doctoress named basically Mary Waters, and he actually left her 10 pounds in his will. And it was on this thing. She had an advertisement in one of the papers along what was then Willings Alley near St. Joseph's Church. She offered cheaper meds and different things as a healer. So it would be here that Trent would basically start using what was then bark or Peruvian bark. It actually is still a known thing today. It has with the quinine in it. It's basically bark of a Sakona tree. It's still a well-known thing today for people doing natural remedies. And unfortunately, it was too little too late. Like I said, that's pretty much, it seems to be based on the evidence. Trent died based on the malaria that he never basically cured from 1748. I mean, he suffered throughout headaches and pain in the wrist and in the ankles. And it's believed, based on this and based on, he probably died along 4th Street, being that the last letter quoting from him said that. And along 4th Street then is where John Todd lived, had a house there. This is the modern day site of where 4th and Chestnut is. It's believed he probably stayed there, or at least in the Indian Queen Tavern, which was like 3 houses down from there. So it's possible in that stretch where he did, because he had no affiliate there with the church or anything. And at that point, almost all he had left was a black trunk, which was filled not only with numerous letters, but also that court suit had eventually that he would have, at least in his remedy, notorious throughout his career. William Trent would reference a black trunk. This, by knowledge, has never been found. It's probably in somebody's attic, I'm sure. And at this point, he would leave it when he went to London with his wife to handle all the business papers. And it would be probably one of the last things he owned and the only true inventory of what he had left when he died. And it's believed that he's buried in Washington Square Park. Back then, it was one of the original squares that William Penn laid out in the Southeast Square. Today, that's believed in this section of the park, there's close to 30,000 unknown soldiers it's a potter's field of enslaved, and there's close to 10,000 soldiers buried there. There today, there's even a monument of Washington, basically around basically an internal flame. And it's believed then that's where they buried anybody that wasn't affiliated with the church and were also penniless, as of which Trent is probably more than likely buried in that section of the park there after December the 1st, 1784. And this is the inventory, one of the original. It's hard to see, but it basically listed numerous. There were 24 bundles of papers that were still in that. As early as the Treaty of Lancaster, he had a copy of it from 1744. He actually had it listed. Believe it or not, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the first lending library in America, started by Benjamin Franklin. The librarian at the time was John Todd Jr., the one that signed the will. He was probably in his handwriting that he wrote this thing that you see before you. And basically on this letter, he also listed 1753 and 54 transaction with the Indians with George Washington and numerous other things. The marble book you saw earlier, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, another waste book of Fort Pitt, and numerous papers dating for almost 40 years of important papers. And it seems like they're divided today, probably in private collectors and different things, but I'm assuming one of these days somebody will say they'll find a black trunk and not sure what it's from, and it's quite possible that's where it's to there. So finally, just to close here, the miscellaneous trivia here talked about the clock that he had made. Believe it or not, this waistcoat and the clock are still one of the only two things that still exist. I visited the clock here. Hopefully it's slowly but surely coming up. I don't know what's going on here. But as we're talking here, this clock exists. It's 8 feet tall. Still exists in historic Peachfield, West Hampton, New Jersey, just below. It's a 1730s. That's the Colonial Dames headquarters, National Society of Colonial Dames in New Jersey. Right before 2020, I visited there literally 3 days before everything shut down. Was able to get in there and see the clock. There's sort of a close-up. You can see, it's hard to see probably here, but it says John Wood above the moon, the sort of the lunar phase that's on there. It says John Wood Sr. Like I said, clockmaker. And like I said, it's 8 feet tall and sits on the stairs. And believe it or not, it was donated went to the family. It went to one of Trent's daughters, married Nathaniel Beeks. Eventually would give it to her daughter, who would marry Daniel Furman. Louisa Furman would eventually give it to, would also run to Anna Rossel, who also owned the waistcoat. Gave it to in her possession of the Trent House. And then eventually Anna Rossel, basically the great-granddaughter of William Trent, was friends with Emily Warren Roebling. Her husband, Washington Roebling, one of the co-engineers of the Brooklyn Bridge. She would acquire this clock and eventually donated to the Colonial Dames. Being that she was in history, she belonged, believe it or not, with Anna Rossel. When they met at the old barracks, it was the Daughters of the American Revolution, and that was called the William Trent Chapel at one point. And they would meet at the old barracks museum, and that was where the clock was at one point. And then eventually it became with the Colonial Dames, as of which Emily Warren Roebling would donate that in 1905, and she would die a month later. And it's been there ever since. So, and just imagine too, this 8-foot clock, Trent acquired probably in the 1750s, and he moved at least 3 different times from Carlisle to New Jersey to Philadelphia to back. So he transported this 8-foot clock, and it still survives because of that, and because of Emily Warren Roebling. So it's magnificent, the fact that it still survives today. And I mentioned about the pocket telescope. As far as we know, it was never given back from General Nathaniel Greene, because there's a letter in 1780 which Trent gives to Colonel Richard Butler to say to Nathaniel Greene, I'm trying to preserve my property and my eyes aren't good at what they used to be. I need my pocket glass back. Ironically, in Greenville, South Carolina, there's a statue, as you can see, of Nathaniel Greene, and look what he's holding. So ironically, you have to wonder, is that the same telescope that Trent lended him back in 1777 when he was here across the Delaware? We'll never know. I thought that was sort of funny. Trent's son, John, who was basically originally had a son born in 1754 that died in infancy that was also going to be named William. Unfortunately, they had him in the wilderness. It was in the mouth of Wills Creek there at the Ohio Company warehouse where he was born. Died in infancy, but John, who eventually became the only other son, would eventually Trent, on Academy, what we know today is Academy Street, where the Trenton School Company, that eventually Trenton Academy, basically would take there because William Trent would be a trustee there in 1783. And by doing so, being a trustee, his kid could go for free. And that's where he sort of got his primary education. This is the stone right next to the Trenton Free Library. And it says this is where the site was of Trenton Academy from 1782 to 1784. And John Trent would not only do that, but he would take classes at what would be Penn Medical School today, basically known then as the College of Physicians. I did research and found his name listed as being that he took classes. They had a list of all the classes dating to the 18th century. John Trent's name up there. Eventually, he would move to Camden, South Carolina, where he resides today at basically the Meeting Cemetery in Camden. But he was a doctor there. Basically what they called he was known basically as a doctor of physique, basically but for 16 years in Camden, South Carolina, where he's buried, him and his wife and his 4 children. Now, Trent's daughter Anne, the first child after William that died in infancy, she was born in 1756. She didn't live too far away. She was actually would eventually live and be Maidenhead. She would marry somebody that crossed the Delaware marbleheader and lifeguard, basically a bodyguard for George Washington named Samuel Raymond. And Raymond, if you look at his pension records, fought at Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine. His list is pretty much every major battle that happened from 1776 to almost 1779. And Trent was there, and this is just a painting from crossing in the Delaware. And basically she would, like I said, it's believed she probably met him after the Washington's troops crossed the Delaware, being that at the time she would have been in her 20s almost at that time. But yeah, eventually she would marry. He not only, like I said, he was a marbleheader from Massachusetts, but would also be what they called Washington's bodyguards, the lifeguards that were formed in 1776. So thank you. Any questions? I covered a lot, but yes.
When they were trying to form Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
Wasn't that land already promised to the Pennsylvania and Virginia colonies?
Yeah, that was a big conflict, because eventually, and I didn't mention too much, but when they arrived back into the colonies, that was the big thing. Virginia already jumped on it and said, hey, wait a minute, we have claim to this land as well. Why don't, and that's when George Mason gets involved. In fact, Trent would even present during he had George Morgan go. He ended up presenting by 1779 and 1780. They went through the Virginia Assembly and tried to fight with them, because they would have a counter argument with everything they tried to, saying that we had the original borders, especially after the Treaty of Lancaster and different things. And yeah, it became a thing where eventually Virginia would win their side of it. And Trent would just, at that point, Vandalia became obsolete, and the Indiana Company of those Indiana shares, that was a sort of a different boundaries. He tried to at least sell them off before they became worthless. And unfortunately, it was too little too late. And like I said, by 1781, 82, Virginia had laid claim in Pennsylvania, and Trent at that point was basically running behind on everything at this point as far as payment. Pretty much for the extent of it, from 1754 till he died, he spent 30 years almost pretty much trying to get back money that he never, probably ever got back.
Unfortunately, the people on Zoom won't be able to see it, but you have some examples of Trent's excellent penmanship, which was one of the things that made him so valuable as a secretary.
Yes, and it's ironic. Yeah, some of the copies of the originals of some of the letters that William Trent would write, you can sort of see his his meticulous handwriting. And it's ironic too, because Trent, I mentioned being the factor for the Ohio Company, but the previous factor, who only lasted about a year, he died of an illness very young, Hugh Parker, was the original factor before Trent. Both those two were both apprentices at the same time to Edward Shippen. So Edward Shippen at that time basically trained both the guys that would run like one of the most powerful land agencies in the world. Both were from his apprenticeship. Yes.
How did you do your research to find that black trunk?
So well, they had a list of the inventory in it. So that's how I knew it's actually listed. Library Company of Philadelphia has the original list. And it says, like on the top, it says deceased it says black trunk of William Trent, deceased. And it has listing 24 bundles, and it lists everything that was in there. So that's probably the only close to inventory we have of his, when he died, anything that was in his possession. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, unfortunately, like I said, a lot of that stuff, like we look at, it says a marble book, Treaty of Stanwix. Like we know that's in Philadelphia because I've seen it. I mean, it's once again, it's hard to say what happened to that. It's like, we don't have that much. I mean, even the clock ended up going, over cross ownership. So it's at least we had that. At least John Todd Jr. would write that, probably in, assuming if he was already dead by that point, it was probably in that 1784, 1785 priest that he was trying to probably get it written down and recorded before, he had to do more or whatever. But yeah, it was listed in that, and it's found if you go to most of my research in Philadelphia. I did Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is on Locust Street there in Philadelphia. Or they also, they're right next to the Library Company, their record. So if you wanted something from there, they could bring it over. And one such thing was this inventory list. It had some land deals, but then it had that list of his inventory. Yes.
So you just mentioned that you saw that marbleized book. So can the general public?
Yes. Yeah, it's called the George, basically it's the Cadwallader Papers, family papers. And if you go into Historical Society of Pennsylvania and it's just any researcher can go in, they just probably have to sign up and they take your ID or whatever. And then you go in and yeah, and there'd be certain boxes. So in this Cadwallader family papers, it was specifically the George Crowan series. And then it was labeled, like they had a list of what's in, okay, this one is fur trading and they might have years on it. And one, it actually just said Treaty of Stanwix's book. So they bring it out just like you would in a box. And it was, and anymore, they don't even used to be, you had to use gloves. Anymore, they claim the gloves are hurt worse than it actually. Now they have the film they can put on it. So you can, it's weird to open it up because you're looking at it and you're going, he's right. He's recording all this. And it's not just that. They have William Penn's stuff there. They have Benjamin Franklin's. You look at something, you'll see Benjamin Franklin's signature. And you're like, wow, he was writing this. I think that's the biggest thing. No matter how many times I went back and re-looked at stuff, you always got a chill doing it because you're picturing him writing it. You know what I mean? Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you the first person to actually write on him, or are there a lot of
So there's been short different things. The only other, they did some short sketches on him, turn of the century. Charles Landis did one. It was probably about 10 pages. But the only other biography that was ever done and he was sort of the groundbreaker in the 1940s, 1947. Joel Slick, who was a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh. In fact, he was part of a protege of Lois Mulkern and these guys, Alfred James, that wrote these Ohio Company books. And he decided to do research on Trent. And he wrote like a mini book called William Trent West. It was like 150 pages or so. And that was in 1947. And since then, there's been no other biography. But he laid the groundwork because he said where he got stuff. In fact, he didn't even cite anything. It just had in the back where he saw stuff. But now in today's age with the digitization and so
now we have, how many pages?
474.
Yeah, we go. So 474 pages.
Yeah, I made sure to not leave any stone unturned. Yeah.
This is the first book
Yeah, as I was researching the multiple, like I said, I started like 2014 seriously doing all that because which would brought me here the first time to talk to Sam and Sean and basically I was writing then by 2019. My reenactment group is Captain William Trent's company. So when we do the unit, I portray what Trent would have worn at least at that time in 1754. And basically, when we do that event, I was trying to find specifically just for that event in Pittsburgh when he tried to go to the Forks of the Ohio and what eventually led to the French Indian War. So we were doing that. I was researching. I got all that together, knowing full well that eventually I wanted to complete that biography. And, I said in 2020 sort of put a snag, but at least with 2020, I was able to, okay, I have 2 more things to go to, University of Michigan and London. And I can't do those, but I can at least write up till that point. And when we were allowed to finally visit, I went up to the University of Michigan, got all the numerous things for, the papers from when he was at Fort Pitt. And then eventually, in London, to not only go to the British Library, because they had originally during 2020, I said, oh, I see you have all these Grand Ohio Company papers. The guy goes, yeah, we've never really looked at them. We just know that that's what they're for. And they're labeled, they're copies of the originals, they're negatives of the originals. And he said, well, honestly, we don't really know what they're actually from. And I said, well, I do. And I said, but I said, that's fine. I said, well, you make copies. This is 2020. I said, you can send them, right? He goes, yeah, let me go through. And he goes, well, that'll be about like $90. And I'm like, sitting here going like $90. And I said, well, I know you got to ship it from London, but how many pages are there? And he goes, 132. I'm like, oh, I'm thinking there's 10 or 11 pages. And these were coffee table pages, like of letters. So it was, and it tied in because it was months. So when I sat in 2020, I made sure I ranged from the London letters from 1769 to 1775. There was probably close to 200. And it was all the letters and put them by month and put them in order. And so then when we went to London, I was just starting to work on the London chapter. So when we sailed over and went there, we got to we were walking the first day, we went to the Strand and I'm like, all right, we're following his footsteps. This is what he's seeing. And, he talked about going into the Charing Crosses where the coaches, he went from Bristol, England, western part of England, then to London. Said he landed in Charing Cross. And, he talked about Charles I statue. It's still there. That's still there. He went up Craven Street, saw Benjamin Franklin, and we're following it to a T, seeing what he's seeing. Now, like I said, a lot of the stuff is modern, but the streets and basically the avenues and alleys are all still there. So it's like to see that is surreal because we sort of went on and I'm going, well, this is what he had there. This is the Crown and Anchor here. And then people are going, you can give tours here. And I said, I know, I was just prepping this before we go over. So